Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our participants in this session that is going to engage with questions around participation, engagement, and social change. And in particular, we're trying to focus in this session both on issues around media and participation and youth, which we have a presentation on, but we also have a presentation on transformation and participation and decolonization in higher education. And interestingly enough, as disparate as they might seem, these two presentations, they're both dealing with very interesting case studies. One is a case study on a Norwegian show called Factuel by Vedat Sevenger, who will join us shortly. And the other presentation focuses on a case study on South Africa and higher education in South Africa. And that is a presentation that I myself will be part of together with a colleague that has also joined us online. And my name is Ylva Rodny-Gumede, and I am a professor in communications, in School of Communication at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And I'm also heading up the international office at the same university. And my colleague, who I will be sharing the presentation with this morning, Montreal time, is Professor Colin Chasi. He is the head of the Institute for Social Change at the University of the Free State and also a professor of communication studies in the Department of Communication Studies at the same university. Colin, I think that we should try to share the presentation that we would like to talk to the audience. And as I said earlier, it's a presentation that deals with universities as sustainable empowerment systems. And the focus is on decolonization and transformation and how it relates to the post-COVID-19 South African higher education landscape. And Colin and I will try to do this as a conversation between the two of us and answer some pertinent questions as to what we think is taking place in this kind of amidst all the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic and how this has impacted higher education globally. But as I said earlier, we will try to focus on our own context, which is the South African higher education landscape. And not only are we focusing on the disruptions that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused in this space, but we're trying to take it forward and see how can these disruptions contribute to a broader transformation of higher education and a decolonization. And for some of you might be well aware that the decolonization debate in many ways emanated out from epicenters in, of course, the whole of the global south, but particularly in South Africa, where we saw a lot of disruptions in higher education, mainly triggered actually by students who re-emphasized the need for a broader transformation and decolonization of the higher education system. So Colin, I will turn to you. You and I have talked a lot about ideas around transformation of higher education and decolonization in particular, and universities as empowerment systems. And we focus in on a lot of different aspects of higher education through our research in our writings, but also in many of the conversations that we've had over the years. So I think the kind of broader outlines of the conversation that we would like to focus on today is firstly, what do we mean when we talk about universities as empowerment systems? And also, as I introduced earlier, what constitutes the decolonial university amidst the disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic and the disruption caused. And we also would like to take that further to what constitutes the decolonial university in light of a sustainability imperative. And that's, of course, very important as well if we talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And then also a little bit more deeper into this idea of the empowerment empowerment aspects of it, or an empowerment system, and the metaphor of empowerment, what that means in light of this idea of a decolonial university. And then, of course, in the end, bring it home to the case study of South Africa and what could a post-COVID-19 South African decolonial university look like, or a higher education system as a whole, maybe even. So Colin, in our conversations, when we talk about universities as empowerment systems, what do we mean? What is it that we're talking about?
Well, thank you so much, Ylva. I think we are recognizing this very strange thing, certainly from South Africa where we work, where empowerment seems to be an idea that is divorced from the things we talk about when we talk about universities. So we talk about empowerment, typically we're talking about broader national processes related to bringing previously marginalized communities into the mainstream in some manner or another, bringing them into workplaces and so on. But when we talk about universities, that is not a term that we see commonly used. And we think that this is something that we should examine and think about, the centrality of empowerment in the logic of education, in the logic of what a university is about. And we often talk, Ylva, as you know, about this idea of the university, for example, being a place, a site where the leading ideas of a particular epoch, of a particular society are taught, are shared, are developed in a wide range of ways. And for us, that charges us to begin to think, for example, about notions such as those to do with innovation, research, to do with the social mobility that universities are able to, that universities enable students, for example, to enjoy from marginalized positions into mainstream positions, into leading positions in a wide range of different ways. In short, if you'd like, this idea that universities are sites that recenter the world in multiple different ways. Ylva and I have written in one piece about universities as, in a sense, sites for new points of entry and exit into different societal positions, so that universities, well constructed, reconceived, become these kind of portals, these kind of gateways to desirable social change in a wide range of different ways. And the idea of empowerment, we think, is key here. We are interested in the idea of empowerment from kind of a Freirean perspective that has been taken up, for example, by Solomon in the field of social work, where that idea of empowerment is seen in terms of that process, in terms of which you take people who are previously marginalized, previously disempowered, previously made to experience helplessness, and you enable them to move into positions where they gain certain capabilities, let's use that word, where they gain certain consciousnesses that enable them to act in particular ways, where they regain their power, their agency in multiple different ways. And the teaching and learning processes in universities are critical to this. What must happen quite clearly, Ylva and I have argued in different ways, is that we must therefore, for example, in our context, rethink the university itself, rethink the physical infrastructure of the university, rethink the pathways that make up the university, rethink the blockages that constitute the institutional structures as we know them. And we think that this is integral to this whole discussion around what is it to have a decolonial university, and so on. So we think, to be short, that we should recenter discussions around universities, around this term empowerment, so that once again we focus ourselves on this very critical transitional process. We recognize in one paper we talk about education as a metaphor. We talk about that metaphor being a metaphor that is closely related to this idea of transformation. And we think we must go further than that and recognize the place of empowerment in that education journey.
So Colin, I think it's interesting when we talk about the idea then of innovation, for example. What is it when we talk about innovation that is so pertinent to a university in a decolonial space? When I think of innovation, what comes to mind is, of course, a lot of issues around the fourth industrial revolution. And I think that when we talk about universities today, it's not only the fourth industrial revolution and the technological aspect that comes in, but it's how universities then have done a shift where also innovation has come to mean, to a certain degree, commercialization. How does that link back to empowerment? And particularly if we think about the idea, that overall idea of access, the decolonial university as an empowerment system that provides access. It seems like these are two colliding forces.
Yes, and I think a key question in our communities and our universities is about what exactly is it that the university does. And in South Africa, certainly from over the last, say, 6, 7, 8 years, where we've focused significantly on these questions around decolonizing the university. Students have talked, for example, about the pain that they feel in the universities, the Black pain that they experience, the pain that is directed towards the marginalized or that is experienced by the marginalized. Pain on account of the rejection, pain on account of the failure or the refusal to enable them to belong. And a lot of these things can be understood in terms of the ways in which the university fundamentally speaks to needs that are not the needs of our students, to needs that are not always the needs of our communities, right? And, you know, I'm still always driven, and Ylva, we've referred to that quote numerously, Achille Mbembe in the Post-Colony, where he writes and he says, we produce so much knowledge about Africa, and all of this knowledge that is generated about Africa and about Africans tells us nothing about who Africans are, right? It tells us a lot about what we are not, right? And we could say that far from the universities in the main generating innovations that speak to our lived needs, a lot of what we do in the universities is, on the one hand, repetition, mimicking, that which we take from the West in a wide range of different ways. But we could also say that the innovations that we generate are precisely innovations that do the same thing, innovations that mimic. In a sense, you could say that these are non-innovations. I don't know if there's such a term, right? These are innovations that are not innovative, right?
Yeah,
that add fundamentally nothing new, at least not for us.
It's an interesting thought, and I think, Colin, when we think we could say the same for the teaching and learning project, for example. We've seen that changes in this space due to, and we'll go a little bit deeper into the idea then of these technological disruptions as well. But I think that we see again and again, if we are going to talk about universities as empowerment systems, what is it in the teaching and learning project that is empowering as well as then disempowering? And I think that the decolonization debate in South Africa, as well as elsewhere globally, focused on teaching and learning and the disempowerment aspects of the teaching and learning project. So I think there is this idea of these forces that seems to almost go against each other all the time, hey? Reversing forces in a sense. And I think that can be said for a lot of things. And my sense is that social mobility, which is so important, particularly in the context of South Africa, where actually the majority of the population was cut off not only from university education, but from basic education in many ways. That the social mobility aspect is so important for students in South Africa, and particularly Black students who have and who are often first generation university goers, as well as in the context of my own university, University of Johannesburg, for example. So that social mobility aspect, how can that be linked to the decolonization project, but then also maybe to this broader idea of a rethinking of campus?
Yes, so this is one of those truly interesting things, and I think we are in phenomenal times, in some respects, fearsome times, terrible times, right? But also times that are filled with opportunity right now, because the disruptions that we're experiencing in relation to COVID have also forced universities, certainly where we are, to rethink the models within which we were stuck, right? So we were mimicking, we were trying to be these great Western institutions in multiple respects. We're trying to offer our education in the very same ways. Let's give one statistic, right? Venue occupancy in a typical South African university is something like 80+%, right? On any given day, 80% of venues at any given time are in use. Now, that presents fundamental challenges to, for example, the attempt to mimic the liberal university model that you find in the West, in a number of the liberal arts curriculum that you find in a wide number of Western universities, because that model assumes the possibility to choose between multiple options of classes that you may take. It assumes the possibility to have a certain amount of redundancies of teaching venues on a campus, right? And so where our universities heretofore have attempted to mimic this Western model, this liberal arts model, in reality, the venue arrangements, the limited physical capacities of our universities, also given the massification that needed to happen from the end of apartheid, right? So during the apartheid years, the universities catered for a very small number of people, the white population in the country in the main, and suddenly they had to take in these huge numbers, right? So very limited physical facilities. The technology.
So to make an interjection there, Colin, I think that is a very important aspect of it, because if you look at my own university, University of Johannesburg, we went then from having served a sort of a small white minority, working class minority of 10,000 students, to broadening the scope of that to be now catering for 55,000 students. It's quite an amazing growth in that sense, eh? With the same resources.
It is, and I think that's
to a great, extent, eh?
And this will be the same pattern at the university where I'm working at the moment, the University of the Free State. Now, the technology that has been available for a long time, the online digital technologies, it has actually been very difficult to get widespread adoption of the uses of these technologies. But suddenly we sit with multiple options, right, to cater for students who are in different positions. On the one hand, this will enable the wide expansion of permutations available that could, in certain instances, allow for wider selection options between a wider menu can now be made available of modules and so on. And outcomes can now be made available to students in ways that was not possible before. Also, We talked about the mobility issue, for example. In our contexts where students really sit in very difficult situations, right? Yeah. At some points, perhaps traveling to university in itself is a challenge. At some points, getting a place to stay at universities is a significant challenge. Now we sit with multiple ways in which we can make contact with our students. And at the same time, we can offer them so much more in greater variety.
So that brings us actually to that segues nicely into the next question, which is a broad one. So then, what constitutes the decolonial university in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and the technological disruptions caused?
I think that we need to go back for this purpose to what we were talking about when we were talking about empowerment. It is not simply the availability of the option or of the possibility that we must look at. We have had these technological possibilities for a very long time, right? But we've not used them. Now that we realize their potential, are we brave enough to make the most of them, right? Let's remember that broad society is known for a very long time, certainly in Africa, right? That where we did not have fiber connections between homes, where we did not have copper connections between homes, we could leapfrog all of those kinds of things using digital technologies. We moved to the cell phones, we moved to, and voila, we are connected in multiple ways. But the universities have not taken advantage of this awareness for a very long time. And we have said, you know what, we must stick to the physical infrastructure. We must make this very limited physical infrastructure do what is practically impossible for it to do. Our venue occupancy, 80+% in the West, often 20%. We were trying to do what is practically not possible, right? Now, COVID is showing us that we can create new combinations. The question is, will we make those combinations in ways that speak to our needs? Mm-hmm. Will we recognize, for example, the unique role that the residential university still has to play within our communities as an anchor institution for certain types of development, for certain types of socialization? The question must be, what types of socialization are we offering? Are we thinking enough about that, right? What change, what transition, what empowerment will a student go through on our campuses? Are we...
I think it's very important to think that through in a little bit more depth, because what we see is that students, particularly students who come from lower income families, they find that being off campus is more difficult than their peers, because on campus there are certain facilities that they don't have access to otherwise. And I think that we see this idea of, if we can build those or upscale some of those services and facilities for those who are in need, then we could also have this blended model of campus services, so not only a blended model of the teaching and learning project, but also a blended campus model, if you wish, of services that can be rendered then to students who cannot access those services outside. And I think that's an interesting part of this empowerment aspect of the university. And I want to throw something else into the mix as well. When we talk about these forces that kind of almost like go against each other, you and I have talked about campus as not the idea of being the microcosm of society or mirroring society, but actually then being part of society, providing these multiple entry and exit points. And I think that we've seen a lot, and many US campuses will be a good example here, in the case of being that, trying to emulate society or being a microcosm of society that provides everything. But in our context, we are trying to break down the walls of campus, to make campus something that's part of its surroundings, a society, to also provide broader services that are empowering for not only our students and researchers and lecturers, but the communities that often they come from.
Yes, and I think, look, you've said a lot that is really interesting. There's a stat from a few years ago, a South African statistic, which said something roughly like a research conducted by Rensburg and others, our former vice chancellor at the University of Johannesburg, which said something like the throughput rate of students who live on campuses was in the 90+%, right? This for the same stream of students, those who lived off campus, and in fact, the general population as such of students, throughput rate was in and around 25%. Right? So it's the ability of the campus to foster certain types of success. Now, in COVID times, it's also important that we don't deny some of the disadvantages that are experienced off campus. We've seen a lot, for example, around the disadvantages that women in particular, young women, are experiencing trying to work from home, right? The poor and marginalized in the rural areas, the disadvantages that they experience. So there has to be a lot of innovativeness in how we make use of these technologies. Otherwise, what will happen is that we, in trying to make the technological turn, a kind of shibboleth of that, we end up dooming a whole generation of poor, marginalized peoples to worse outcomes than we currently have at the moment. The question is,
an increase in gender-based violence as well, which means that often it's women and children who have suffered in the home environment due to lockdowns and the COVID pandemic.
Yes, so there's need for a lot of rethinking around what are the boundaries of the university, what should be the boundaries of a decolonized university. The core functioning of a university must change. And I think therein lies a great decolonial opportunity.
Yes.
Do we have the courage to rethink?
That's a very good question. That's a very good, maybe we'll come there as well as we, what then, what's the sustainability sort of impairment? How does that link then back to these disruptions?
Well, I think that the challenge for universities is to be sustainable in multiple directions.
Colin, I think that you closed down the slides, unfortunately.
Oh. Perhaps we move on without this. Is that okay? I'm trying to figure out how I've done that, and I don't. It says I'm still sharing.
Yes, but I think you're sharing the slideshow instead of the. If you can just go to a slide maybe and open it up on your screen. But if you can't do it, it's fine. So let's talk to this idea then of the sustainability imperative.
Yes, so the sustainability imperative, I think, is an imperative we must pay attention to. How does the university speak and act the language of sustainability in relation to its students, in relation to the communities that it finds itself in? Our universities, we've already talked about this way in which the knowledge that we produce is often knowledge for the West, is often the knowledge that we teach is often knowledge from the West, so that the students that we teach are taught to become young Western ladies and gentlemen in some particular manner. We've talked about, and we love this reference to Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, Something Torn, when Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about how the colonial experience involved a kind of beheading of Africans. And if you can take that as a kind of metaphorical reference to this epistemicide that befalls Africans in so many different ways. And if you can also think of this beheading as a process that relates to the head of African societies, these universities, being dislocated in so many different ways from the bodies that they supposedly serve.
Yes.
We have a challenge to reconnect African universities, our universities, to the bodies that they claim to serve. And this moment of disruption could be a moment to change the norms, could be a moment to reconnect with the everyday lived needs and experiences, because the language that we have used in the past, norms that we have lived by in the past, have been disrupted. The question is, do we have the fundamental courage to think anew?
I think that's interesting, and I'm going to try to kind of summarize them, because I think then that sort of begs the question, what is it that we need to have also the courage to do? And I think that we often have in this, when we've talked about the disruptions, not only in the South African context, but globally, it are issues around access, whether that is then for lowering the threshold in terms of financial, the cost of accessing higher education, the cost of studying as a whole. We mentioned that, or you mentioned that in the idea of students, then not only is it tuition fees that brings to bear on how you access higher education, it's getting onto campus, there are a lot of other things, there are textbooks, etc., etc. And I think so there's this idea of then the increased access through, you know, a redistribution maybe that needs to happen of financial gains. And I'm wondering, will we be brave enough as universities to dig into these reserves, or even see that there have been gains here and savings that could be redistributed. And I think that's one important aspect that university leadership has to engage with. I think on the teaching and learning side, it's a little bit the idea then of this flexibility of learning paths, of study paths, of admissions, for example, and a flexibility in the teaching and learning project more broadly in terms of adapting methods and pedagogy for this new online space, and how you do that, and not to have certain voices drown out. I always make the analogy that when you stand in front of a class, you can pick up on who's not included often. Well, you and I, Colin, and I imagine a lot of our colleagues listening in as well, are used to very big classes, but still you get a sense of reading a mood in the class, and I tend to be the teacher who runs up and down in the classrooms and in between benches in the corridors of lecture halls to try to engage students. But that's very difficult in an online environment, and I've noticed that women, female voices in particular, seems to be quite drowned out in the online environment. So we need to be brave enough to take on those discussions as well. Then I think it's interesting to just, when we talk about diversity and providing access, for us in South Africa, of course, it's very important then to engage with an international audience, and particularly our African brothers and sisters, and provide access to students from the continent into South African universities, and how we can do that. And the online environment have provided some access to this idea then that we can open up for students to register out of seat. They don't have to pay the same tuition fees maybe, they don't have the cost of medical aid, visas, and often that's been unattainable as well due to lockdown and travel restrictions and so on. So I think that this can also then be extended, as we know, to exchanges of students and staff and research engagement more broadly as well, of course. So some of these things I think have been mentioned in various aspects, but maybe not then with the angle into the particular student body maybe that we serve in South Africa, which are often then these students who are first generation university goers, for example. But I think more broadly, and this is something that you have talked to now, is the campus itself. And will we be brave enough to see that with these new spaces that have created with people working from home, for example, to really rethink and be innovative in the way that we think of campus in this empowerment space, and as a metaphor for empowerment, this physical structure that is campus. And I think that is my last question to you. How do we do that best, and how can we do that?
I think that there are multiple possibilities. We need to rethink what we have inherited, what we have been given, what we have taken from colonial times, from colonial practices, right? Yes, sometimes we've built the buildings, but we've built them as extensions of what we were given, right? And we need to realize that there is an opportunity to rethink even the basic uses and purposes and outcomes that are related to the buildings as we currently have them. There's a massive opportunity there. This is an important set of opportunities because it relates to fundamental problems that we have, right? 80% venue occupancy, right? How do we rethink that? The digital connectivity possibilities that we have. We have courses, departments that are teaching 10 students, right? Because the modules are undersubscribed in a particular way. Could we imagine a sharing of resources across regional universities with international partnerships, right? Could we imagine new ways to generate economies of scale where economies of scale are required, right? That keep certain otherwise marginalized and marginal programs alive and interesting and viable in different ways. But I think I'd like to maybe very briefly, Ylva, as a quick last note perhaps, just speak to some of these points that are on the slides that you went through a little bit, but to point out that these are all interconnected bits and pieces, right? It turns out that flexibility in admissions and study paths has something to do with changing financial thresholds. It turns out that in our current system, we still have students coming to university, spending a whole year paying room and board, right? Without the possibility to find work, because you know what? We are in an economy with 40% unemployment, right? And these are poor students investing heavily to do one module the whole year. Now we have the possibility to rethink these things. How can we enable a student to study that one module from home? How can we enable a student to overload so that they finish a degree in 2 years or 1 year because they're able to do it? Under current arrangements where we have these physical limitations to how a student can navigate through the system, we are compelled to prevent a student who could finish their degree in 1 year or in 2 years. We're compelled to force them to finish it in 3 or 4, right? And there are significant cost savings for the student in doing the degree in 2 years, right? I don't have to pay room and board for 3 years. I only paid for 1, for example, right? So there are efficiencies for the student that can be generated under these new arrangements. Some of these are made available through the new technological possibilities that we have finally started to embrace. But what we are saying repeatedly is these gains, the technological gains that we have started to realize, mean nothing if we don't have the courage to rethink what it means to be a university. Talking about allowing students to take modules across a regional system, for example, means challenging what it means to speak of a university. Its boundaries are being challenged in interesting different ways under that arrangement, for example. Do we have the courage? Which universities will survive this moment? I think that those that are courageous likely will.
Thank you for that, Colin. I think it's really interesting, and I think that there are a lot of things to set out in this space, and we kind of touched upon it a little bit and tried to sort of link up the notes. I'm going to open up for questions from our participants and the audience as well. It's very sad that we didn't get with us Sevinse from Nordcentrum's Media Forum. But it left a lot of time to talk to the South African case study instead, which is of course highly appreciated, and I'm really appreciative of our audience that you have allowed us that. So please, colleagues, I think we were absolutely happy to engage with you in a discussion around some of these points, and I'm sure you all have comments from your own context and environments as well, and we are very happy, Colin and I, to take this way beyond the South African borders or the African continent as well. So please just raise your hand, or feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any questions that you might have. And there is a chat box as well where we can post questions. And don't be shy. It's my as they say in class, you know, if you don't ask any questions, I will pick on someone to start the conversation. And of course, Colin and I are busy writing a paper under the sort of broader heading of sort of the university as an empowerment system in the decolonial context as well, that we very hoping to be able to share through the proceeds of this, the broader UNESCO conference that we're all part of. I don't know if...
I think Aya has a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, so I find that a lot of times there's this sense of like passing the buck, of like, when we want to make these sort of larger systemic changes, that everyone kind of feels like somebody else is ultimately more responsible for that, and I just have my little piece, and this is what I have control over, and what am I to do? And this kind of relates to this sort of competency we have in like naming the oppressions, but not being able to move into this stage of actually addressing them and feeling that sense of bravery in like, this is, you know, maybe not my place, but I'm going to take this moment and I'm going to make this challenge. And I was just wondering, even maybe in your own experience, if you could speak to like how we might move into that space, like some practical ways of kind of embracing that courage, or just some inspiration. Yeah. Or
Yes, I mean, you know, I mean, on an overall level, I'm sure Colin has lots to say to this as well. I mean, I feel that there is a sense that, you know, as Colin and I are both academics in the sense that we have, you know, spend most of our academic careers as teachers, as lecturers, you know, working with students and as supervisors of, you know, I think we both supervise still, but the teaching we don't do much of, because all of a sudden we both in a position where we moved into university management. In many ways, and I think this is problematic in any space, is that I felt much more closer to some of these issues and felt much more empowered, sorry, no pun intended, to take on some of these issues as a lecturer than I do in management. And of course, it should be some different. I mean, I sit in an interesting context where my immediate mandate is to be in charge of all international projects of the university, whether it's the students, full-time degree students, to the short-time, exchange students, to all our international partnerships, to the international networks that we belong to. And you address these issues through these kind of forums, but as you say, they're more difficult to bring back home to do something concrete about. I think we stand at sort of a threshold here where we can actually make changes because of, and this is something that we didn't really get to in our conversation today, because of these technological disruptions, because of these kind of changes that are happening right now, there's a momentum of change that is taking place. And if we then insert the narrative of empowerment, of care, of ethics into these conversations, I think we have an opportunity to make certain changes. That's just my sort of, and I realize that doesn't go far enough in terms of answering your question, but it is some kind of a start, I guess. Colin, I don't know what you would say to that.
I think it's pretty much along the same lines. I mean, I made the decision about 2 years ago, to also make that move away from teaching in a department, heading a department, which I'd done for a good period, and made the decision to get into the management space. And I am finding in my instance that we are able to talk about some of these big things. So we are talking about the boundaries of the university. We are talking about the uses of the university buildings. We are talking about how we can generate new kinds of access for our students in the different positions that they're in. At the unit that I work for, the unit that I direct, called the Unit for Institutional Change and Social Justice, part of our mandate is to also, amongst other things, look at gender equity and anti-discrimination within the context of the university. And we are finding there that there's a lot of scope for academics to impact upon, and academics and other members of the university community to impact upon actual practices that we take part in, or that we otherwise take for granted. We're engaging, for example, at the moment with a group of lecturers in nursing, right, who are talking about consent in the context of the female body, in the context of the gynecological examination. What is consent? How is it actuated? Engaging with our student communities, so that this idea of consent, and we're connecting it with other ideas to do with consent, for example, in the context of rape and so on. So yes, we're talking about sort of the kind of gynecological rape and obstetric rape and so on, but we're connecting it with other notions, and we're connecting this to discussions around the broader empowerment of women. And so there are multiple avenues, sometimes discipline-based, sometimes institutional. And I think what we need is to step out from our comfort zones. And what we need is to recognize the fact that, yes, I'm in nursing. And yes, what I'm working on is seemingly technical knowledge, right? This is how you conduct a gynecological examination, and these are the options available. And how do I take my knowledge? How do I relate it to a person, two persons? How do I move it into broader conversations, broader societal change processes? And these colleagues are showing that in multiple ways you can do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting process, because I think that we often also think about change as being something that is massive and usually disruptive. And I mean, the COVID pandemic, of course, have been massively disruptive and triggered massive change. But it's also these small bits and bobs that comes into play. That I think bits and bobs, I shouldn't say it that way, but there are other things that comes into play here. Michael, you have your hand up, please.
Great. It's a pleasure to see the two of you here today with us. It's kind of strange, actually. I'm sitting at home, and here we are in this international forum. And yeah, in relation to that, I mean, this is an international forum and you are the dispatch from South Africa. So there's a lot more that we probably would want to hear and would want to probe you on. And one of the things I think before we finish in 11 minutes, we maybe could hear from Colin about the Ubuntu for Warriors book, you know, very briefly, and maybe how Ubuntu connects to some of the conversation that we've had so far. But what I'd like to issue as a challenge to both of you is to do what I'd call storying the narrative. So far, you know, you've spoken always very abstractly. And so let's talk about a student or a category of students or a community that was somehow impacted. Like go be journalists in the field and get that, you know, that quote, you know, like what, you know, someone's energy, maybe bring that into the story. And that could be storying the administrator too. It could be storying the professor, doesn't it? You know, I just wonder if there's an anecdote, you know, share something. You are the dispatch.
You know,
I'd love to. I think it's brilliant.
Yes, yeah, there are so many, and it's interesting that you say that, Michael, because actually Colin and I, a few years back, wrote a paper where we foregrounded not only our own stories in different ways, our own stories as being students, our own stories as being lecturers, and actually we highlighted a couple of aspects of how we sometimes also become part of a system that inflicts pain. And we reflected very concretely on a couple of cases where things have gone wrong, for example, where we felt that we have not done right by our students, and actually highlighted cases in that space. I mean, I think coming back to this particular context and the COVID pandemic, I mean, one example will be the students, what we did very early on, where we realized that we were going into a lockdown and that we needed to move the teaching project online, was to quickly try to acquire as many laptops as possible to be distributed to students who did not have access otherwise, who then would not be able to access the teaching and learning project from home. The dispatching of, firstly, figuring out the system or putting a system in place, rather say that, where we could distribute these laptops, first acquiring them and distribute them. And you can imagine a university then where you have 55,000 students, and most of them are students where there are these kind of needs, very, very concrete needs. So that was one thing. From my perspective, very quickly then it became clear that how do we do this for the international students? The international students were not initially provided the same data, for example, that we provided our local students with. We couldn't distribute these laptops to other contexts than locally within South Africa. And often also there was very, very difficult to do it even across regional borders within South Africa. Hey? So some of these things are aspects of this, the changes and the disruptive changes that we don't think about. We also realized that we very quickly struggle to provide other services to our students, medical aid, for example, the access to psychological services. We had to very quickly move our psychological services and our counselors online. And how do we do that? And how do we provide counseling in a context where people often don't have privacy at home, even if they have acquired a laptop, for example? So there were a lot of these hurdles to overcome, and I'm sure a lot of you can recognize this and echo that. But now I'm taking up too much space. I'm sure Colin has examples as well. Did we lose Professor Chasi? He seems to be coming and going a bit.
I'm muted. I was muted. I wanted to share very briefly the video, the cover of the circumstances surrounding Professor Bongani Mayosi's tenure, crucible for senior Black academic staff. Now, this relates to an event that we've talked to in warm terms about the student uprisings, calling for things in glowing terms, right? It's good to push for decolonization. And what we have with Professor Mayosi is this very tragic circumstance where this man, a very successful professor, head of department of medicine, in the medicine faculty, working on genetics and stuff to do with art, came up with a base in and around 2015 and so on. A man doing great work, internationally impactful work in medicine. His department across the board doing great things under his leadership. Taken on, put into the position of Dean of the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Cape Town. And within a short period of 2 odd years, he commits suicide, or he dies by suicide, right? And the study that I put before you tries to understand this, tries to understand how this extraordinarily competent man would...
Sorry, Colin, I think your connection is unstable.
This department.
Colin,
I hope that
we are losing you, Colin. I don't know if you hear us, but your connection is very unstable. Yeah.
No. Can I be heard now or not?
Yeah, drop your video maybe.
Yeah, we can. We can
I'll
mute
drop my video.
as well, maybe, and see how that works.
All right, I will stop my video and then hopefully I can be heard now. Yes.
Yeah, do go ahead.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
All right. So I was saying that. So Professor Mayosi, this incredibly competent man, developed this department, leadership. His own research is world renowned. Put into the position of dean. There's this protest for decolonization, and within 2 years, he dies of suicide. And this study tries to understand this, to understand the unique positions, particularly of Black academics in South Africa, in the context of these calls for decolonization, the pressures from students, the pressures from Black staff who are calling for decolonization, the pressures of the system to remain the same or to not change, the pressures to deliver excellence and to find solutions that enable excellence to be delivered. And what this study does, and it speaks this language, not explicitly, but it speaks this language of empowerment. And it says, how do we empower? How do we empower even the incredibly competent to be able to deliver in contexts that are often debilitating, right? How do we recognize that the colonial, post-apartheid dynamic is one that often militates against competence, militates against performance? And so I think that in this time, as we move into the post-COVID environment, as we think about the disruptions that are upon us, let's also think about those people who are in those in-between positions, who experience this pressure to innovate, right? Who experience this pressure to create access, right? Who experience this pressure from a system that will not change, does not want to change, that wants to continue to mimic universities in the West and so on. Let's think about how we can empower them. And that is one of the great stories of our moment, right? One of the great untold stories. How do you and the people who are put into the position to facilitate this change, how do you enable them to do it? Who are put into this position to lead the change? And the Professor Mayosi story is an incredible story that speaks of a moment where we failed to do so. And I fear that we might have, in lesser form, a few others.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Colin. I am watching the time a bit, and I realize that we are running out of time for this particular segment of the seminar. And I am once again very grateful and thankful to you all for allowing us to take up this space, since we now had more time on our hands for our own presentation, Colin and I, and we are looking forward to sharing more of these kind of conversations and some of the research that we will be writing up as well. Without much further ado, I would also like to remind everyone that at 3:30 this afternoon, Montreal time, there is the open session or the happy hour session, where we can all come together and talk some more and share ideas from the seminar or the colloquium throughout the day. And that, of course, will be looking forward to seeing you all in that fora as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day further, or a lovely evening further for those of you who are in other parts of the world.
Okay, and on behalf of the organizers, etc., I would like to thank you, Ylva and Colin, for your presentation. Look forward to maybe having that conversation with you at the end of the day. And I know as well that we will have another conversation on June 9th for another event to do with the International Association for Media and Communication Research. So look forward to that as well. So thanks everyone for attending this session, and see you in the other conference sessions.
Thank you very, very much.